Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hello, everyone. Today on the show, we have Aimee Byrd. She is an author, speaker, blogger, and podcaster. She has written several books, including Recovering from Biblical Manhood and Womanhood and Sexual Reformation. Her latest work, The Hope in Our Scars, peels back the Christian church's underlying and pervasive theology of power to face the shame that lurks there. Having trodden her own path of disillusionment, Aimee invites the reader to find faith amidst the chaos of the church's status quo. You can find out more about Aimee at aimeebyrd.com. Here's Aimee now. It is really, really, really good to have Aimee Byrd with me today. I am so happy to be talking to you all about the work that you're doing and the work that's come out. And I want you to be able to take a few moments to introduce yourself, and then we will start talking about your story. Go for it.
Okay, Rachel, thank you. Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for having me on. So The Hope in Our Scars is my 7th book. So I've been writing for a while, but this is the first one that kind of has some memoir to it. And a lot of that is a result of my writing itself. So like sharing a little bit about myself, I became an author out of the loneliness really of a thinking woman in the church. It's just trying to get some conversations started, trying to be in some conversations. I have a love for theology and wanting to be in that creative world. And so I began to write about it in my first book, hoping that that could be just kind of like a tool for women to start talking about these things. But each book kind of built off the next with some more struggles, really, for me. But I was finding as I got invited to speak in different places that there are definitely a lot of women like me feeling the same way, having the same struggles in the church. And so I just started writing about all these issues. I got myself in a bit of trouble with one of them where I'm critiquing more of these ideas of biblical manhood and womanhood that I was swimming in with so many others. And so I went through some pretty serious spiritual abuse in the church, which we can talk about more in the interview. But so The Hope in Our Scars is really as a result of that. And even asking myself, do I want to keep doing this? Because I don't need to. To be an author, I didn't think, but turns out like I just am one, I guess. That's how I process. But other than my writing and my speaking, I'm a mom. I have 3 young adult, quote unquote, children on their way out of the nest now. And I love hiking. I love reading. I like bourbon. Some other interests in my life.
Right. So interestingly, right. Also, as the mom of 3 young adult children, it is an interesting transitional time, and an interesting time too when you've been raised a particular way to really see the differentiation in your children's lives and what you've been able to provide for them, the lessons, the messages. How their life, their existence, their way of looking at themselves probably in the world is so different from what yours was at that time in your life, right? Maybe we can start with that and then we'll go backwards. Go for it.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like interestingly too, with what I went through, they were at very transformational stages, in the youth group at church. And they sadly witnessed some pretty horrible stuff being said about me. Their mother publicly online. So, they know me to be one person, and they would see things like me being called the Great Whore of Babylon or, godless and Jezebel and their dad, whom they love, they would see written, if her husband really loved her, he'd shut her up, things like this. So these weren't just like jerks on the internet. They were leaders. They were pastors and elders. And as it turned out, one of our own elders in our church, who was also the youth leader, was in that group, not saying those horrible things about me, but not notifying me, not rebuking anyone for doing it. I mean, they were like calling ahead of my speaking engagements and warning the people who booked me and the churches, like, guard yourselves, guard your families from this dangerous woman. So, like, they're seeing all this stuff being said about me, and they know me, right? I'm their mom. So, sadly, I feel like in some ways they had a much worse experience than I had as a teenager in the church. The messages that they saw were just terrible. And then, as I thought and was told by those who, agreed this is horrible in my denomination, to use the proper church order to address this, which was a very long process of 2 years, which became like much more traumatizing than the actual public harm that was being done. They saw all that. So they saw that not only these aren't just fringe people, they're in a culture where this is enabled in our church, in our presbytery. We are OPC, Orthodox Presbyterian Church denomination. So I wasn't the only one who lost relationships. They were too. So yeah, for parenting through all that, that was pretty tough.
My goodness. Wow. And so, right. And so we'll come back to that. I just wanted to get a sense of what this has also been like for them and also for you, because as a parent, you're going to have a lot of people's hearts in your hands, right? It's a lot to hold on to, including your own. And I love this line before we move it to something else. I love this line about when you said, my children know me, with the stress on know. And there was this great quote that I came across, but it was basically the reminder not to look at yourself through the lens and through the eyes of people who never knew you.
That's good. Yeah.
And it's a really important thing, because when you get involved in something where they have a sense of how you're supposed to be, and they've decided what's wrong with you, they've decided what's right about you, but from sort of putting an overlay over you and seeing you that way, then they didn't take the time and maybe didn't even have the interest in really getting to know you. And the people who know you, love you and trust you, respect you. And that's really all that matters.
Yeah, that's insightful. I think I really struggled with that in some ways. There's the online personalities who, it's troubling that they're officers in my denomination and think this about me. But it was a real struggle with that elder in my church, to think it's not, we had like 175 people, that church. I thought we were friends. So it was just a deep violation of trust. And then having to decide how much to share and how much not to share with different friends that I have in the church, and not wanting to, I was trying to handle it in as godly of a way as, as I could and knew how, and really praying through that. But I feel like, other friendships where I felt known, I didn't feel known going through. I think that people experience that in different ways too, not just when somebody's doing something to you or saying something about you, but, even when you go through health problems or, loss in your family or divorce, you start realizing how superficial some of your relationships are.
Oh, absolutely right. And the betrayal of it all is crushing. It really is crushing, especially when you're talking about the number of people who were there, which is tiny, right? It's like a cul-de-sac, like I'm just thinking of like a little neighborhood, right? And about that same amount of people. And so you really do have an expectation that they're going to have your back.
Yeah, and there's a humiliation there for sure. To have
Mm-hmm.
these things being said about me by leaders in our denomination, um, and in that complementarian world that I was in, all the tiptoeing I did to try not to look like a troublemaker, like to uh, all the ways that I made myself smaller and smaller and smaller were to no avail. And it was interesting because as I was going through the process of addressing it, and it's not because I wanted these men to be punished. And they use language like that in the book of church order, the book of discipline or whatever. It's not that, oh, I want these men to be punished, but I did very strongly feel like there are certain qualifications for eldership in a church, leadership of that level, ordination. And I believed that they disqualified themselves. And it doesn't have to be a punishment as much as a recognition. And, what I would hope for is a repentance of saying, like, wow, I used this position to harm somebody. Maybe I should step down and be ministered to and shepherded myself so that I don't harm anyone else and that I wouldn't, with my own elder, I felt like, I mean, my body was just screaming on the way to church, right? Like, turn around, go the other way. You're not safe here. He'd be serving communion. What does that do to your soul? When you like, that's just so hard. Or, still teaching the youth group and all these other things. So you're just thinking it really messes with your sense of self. That's where like that spiritual abuse, it's traumatizing. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's just multiple layers to it all.
Right. Oh, yes, yes. And then some. So I want to be able to, at some point, too, I wrote down a lot of things that I want to be able to get into with you, but let's let the listeners have a chance to kind of get to know you and your story for a little bit, and then we'll dig into some specifics. So tell me where this all began.
Well, it began years ago. It started brewing. One of the books I wrote was called Why Can't We Be Friends? And it was kind of a biblical theological argument for friendship between the sexes in the church and setting that up as sacred siblingship. How do you treat a sibling? This is the word that Paul uses to describe the church the most. It's as he addresses us as siblings. So, you know, far more than any of the other ways that he addresses us is as siblings. What can we learn from ancient siblingship, Near Eastern siblingship, and what is evoked by that name? What's our great honor and responsibility to one another? Instead of avoiding one another, how can we advocate for one another's holiness? Was the whole point of the book. And it was, something that I was addressing out of my own experiences and so many others I was hearing from as a woman in a lot of male spaces in the church, and the whole way that the Billy Graham rule has been applied in so many situations, whether it's like women in seminary who can't have the same meetings with their professor as the male students. Or, for me, when I found myself walking at night down unsafe alleys in the rain in a dangerous city alone, when I could have been given a ride to my car. But because I was a woman and just like the appearances of how that might look, giving me a ride, that's what led me to write that book. But people started coming out then saying, oh, Byrd saying that married men and women can have candlelight dinners together, silly stuff like that, just really misrepresenting my work and that I'm going to pretty much lead all these people to having affairs. So it started there, which I brushed off so much of that, but I did have to combat a lot of like bad faith reviews of my book. And then I wrote this book that I addressed more directly the teachings of biblical manhood and womanhood. And so there was a book put out over 30 years ago by the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood with multiple contributors called Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. And it was all about evangelical feminism being this big threat in the church. And so we need to, instill this teaching of biblical manhood and womanhood to save the church. I think that in so many complementarian churches, we've just been indoctrinated with material from CBMW, the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. And they put this word biblical in front of it, right? Like it's kind of manipulative. It makes this is the biblical teaching. So my book was called Recovering from Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. I was a little apprehensive about using that title. It wasn't something I picked to begin with, but now I see just how true that title is. But the book itself was an invitation. It was an invitation to look at the male and female voice and how they function in scripture, compare that to now in the church, to look at the nature of discipleship, and also, again, our great responsibilities as brothers and sisters in the church. And let me tell you, that's when the bad names started really coming out. There was this group, it was a Facebook group of quote unquote reformed leaders, mainly. You didn't have to be a leader to be in the group, but it was mainly leaders. This is where all the stuff is being said about me. And they're kind of coordinating from there to call ahead of my speaking engagements, to sabotage my Amazon page, to use their anonymous accounts on social media to harass me. They were making memes of my books, like "Why Can't We Be Friends" became a meme. They changed the cover of my book to say "Why Can't We Be Naked," and changed everything on there. Ha ha ha! Isn't that funny? The next thing you see it all over Twitter with anonymous accounts posting it. It wasn't just me. They were definitely there was a lot of racism on there. There was a lot of homophobia on there. They were going after other women, but I just kind of became their number one favorite. And so this woman reached out to me and she said, "I was aware of this group. I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. Like I said, I thought my elder was in there to kind of keep an eye on things, I thought he'd tell me." Anyway, this woman who I did not know reached out to me and said, "Look, I think you need to see what's being said about you. It's really concerning." She starts sending me screenshots and I'm thinking, okay, I might get a handful of screenshots that aren't very savory. Let me tell you, Rachel, she just starts sending me nonstop screenshots of threads that get into the hundreds of comments from morning to night, like late hours of the night. What are you people doing all day? And like I said, these shocking things are being said. And then they're finding my videos, but they're looking at these videos that I did professionally, with Zondervan. And so I'm in a nice sweater and my hair's down and they're picking it apart saying she looks brute. Her femininity is withdrawn. And, she needs to brush her hair, they were sharing websites, misogynistic quotes by the church fathers and thinking this is great. It was so concerning because some of these names I recognize as people I've collaborated with before in parachurch organizations, academics that I knew, and pastors that I knew. And I just thought, what in the world? So, I had to take this to my pastor and say, one of our elders is in this group, but there's a bunch of men in here in our denomination. I wasn't aware that they were calling ahead of my speaking engagements like this. They even made a joke that I was going on this one retreat for the OPC women as their 20-year anniversary retreat speaker the following week. And it was in the middle of nowhere, this retreat center that I was driving to. And they were first of all, they called ahead like crazy to cause trouble and raise suspicions about me. Then they were joking, that they might have their own meetup there at the same time. So I didn't know, what am I dropping into here? So yeah, that was the beginning.
Wow, that was the beginning. Okay. What's so difficult about all of that is, especially if you haven't dealt with it en masse in that way, that social media, unfortunately, can absolutely provide, where it is just a consistent flow, like a tidal wave. And exactly as you're asking, what are these people doing all day? Well, they're doing this. It's quite incredible because I think they think they're doing a couple things, right? As you probably know, I think they think they're doing something good. They're doing God's work. but they're also, I think, trying to prove something about themselves to other people. So it is so much about people posturing for their own protection and their own reputations, using you as the venue for that. And when you are able to develop a sense of that it's sort of just going through you or around you, but it isn't about you, it is really, really important. What's also important to think about is this, that if in an interview where you're wearing a sweater and your hair is down and they're going to pick that apart, and today where you have a hat on and a tank top, they're going to pick that apart. And so I often tell people when I'm doing counseling that if no matter what you do, you've done it wrong and it's worthy of criticism, then it's no longer about you. If you went to the right and that was wrong, if you went to the left and that was wrong, it's not about you. It's about those people being in a position where they feel they need to correct you and criticize you because somehow that works for them or that works for the organization. But again, you're just kind of the venue for them being able to do that for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the box that they put you in gets smaller and small. Like you need to be smaller and smaller and smaller. And I definitely was in a situation where I felt like I'm trying to climb out of this way that they're publicly trying to ruin my reputation and tell me what kind of person I am and tell me what my motives are. And I'm like, no, that's not me. That's not me. There's also this part of you is like, is that me? Is this how I come off? All those, do I look brute? Like all these different things. It messes with your sense of self. And, I have very good people in my life, like my husband, my children, my friends. And, my church leaders, for the most part at the time, were saying, you know, nothing that you've done is worthy of this. We're going to help support you through this. But they were in no way equipped to handle this. I think it's so important for leaders to be trauma informed. They were doing things that they thought were good for me, but further harming me by what they were doing. Plus, I was in a denomination where I really can't hold the pen to my own story. Like, I didn't have a voice in the process of addressing this through proper church channels. So I had to rely on their voices and their understanding and their interactions with this elder behind closed doors and all these other conversations about me behind closed doors. And the whole time I kept thinking that I need to show my children that you stand up to this kind of thing, like that you can handle this in a mature way. And I really thought and was told by so many in my denomination that this would all be handled well. And each step of the process was another shocking revelation for me and further traumatizing. And it was just so strange, surreal almost to think that, and I realized, and it took me, I'm kind of embarrassed to say it, it took me 2 years because I tried to go through the whole process. And so to get to the end of that and realize, oh, sometimes you got to show your kids that you got to leave. Like, I didn't want to be like a leaver or a quitter, but sometimes that's very much the right thing to do, is to step out of these spaces and that you are maybe becoming complicit in your own abuse by staying.
Right. When you say that, you feel bad about saying that it took 2 years. I mean, I'm impressed that it just took 2 years because there's so much involved in that time frame of reflecting, like you're saying, well, maybe I am that. Maybe they are right. Like that all gets woven in if you're a person of conscience, if you care about what you're doing right or wrong, if you care about how you come across, if you care about the example you're setting, whatever else. And so that's going to get under your skin and that takes some time to undo. And then just dealing with having to duck and cover and pivot and, move out of the way. But yeah, exactly as you're saying, sometimes the thing that you get to is it's like having an argument with someone who's not open to hearing what you're saying, then all you're doing is depleting your own personal resources for nothing.
That's such a good point. The work that you have to do, the emotional work that you have to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But it's
Yeah,
hard.
I had to keep asking myself, like, and I had to come to a point, and and I write about this in The Hope in Our Scars, that some things that you think are so important and are even good things, like your reputation, I had to be like, what kind of person do I want to be? Can I live with and be most true to my values? I don't want to be the person who's always having to explain myself. I don't want to have to engage in all of these. That's not what I wrote. That's not at all what's in the book. Or, no, actually, I'm this person, not that person. And how much time do I give these people? And you have to let go of what everybody else who's listening to them in different ways, because these men had a lot of influence in a lot of different churches. And it even affected my vocation then, right? Because this was my audience of readers. And I got blacklisted so much out of those spaces. I really had to lay a lot of that down and say, like, Christ does know me. He knows me. Is that good enough? And it's kind of a scary thought at first, but then it's freeing on the other end.
Mhm. I also think just to be able to talk about the idea of scars, it's a different word than hurt,
Right.
you know,
Or wound, even.
or wound. Exactly right. So there's a lot we could talk about with the choice of that word. Tell me what that meant to you.
Yeah, I feel like I wrote this book as I was developing more scars over my wounds. What I wanted to share so much was how I was ministered to, like, because there's a lot of deconstruction right now and a lot of books about deconstruction. And I think they're important to read. And I have a lot of understanding and sympathy for that. But I also, in my situation, I feel like, in this word hope too, it's like, it's not sentimental. Like, hope isn't sentimental. It bears scars. And so, like, you look at your wound, and I think the ability to name it, to name your wounds, is an act of hope, because you're looking at something and saying, this isn't right. This isn't healthy. This isn't beautiful. This isn't meant to be like this. There's something we're missing here. And so that's why I think, as you're healing, and this is so important, I think that we need community for this, and why church should be this. It's like when you're healing and you're forming scars, and you kind of run your finger over a scar, and it's boundaried, right? It's thicker than the rest of your skin. It got tougher there. And so your scars bear testimony. They bear so much testimony to, like, where you've come from, what's happened to you, who met you there, and I think where you're going too. So there's like a story in our scars that I think we need to tell, because we all have scars. And so church is the very place that we should be able to come. And, it's interesting that one of the first things Christ does in his resurrected body is show his scars. Like, they went through, they didn't disappear. I think that that's very important. It wasn't just to identify him. Yeah, I mean, I just think that the present, Walter Brueggemann said, the present is both darker and more glorious than we want it to be. And we cannot be co-opted managers of this age. And I think our scars show that so much, like the subversiveness of hope. Like, okay, I can name this darkness that happened, and I need people to bear that story. I need people to hold that story. But the present is also more glorious, you know, than I can see it as too. So, and I think that when we have people to bear our testimony with, and name and lament with, these are all parts of our healing. It provokes their own stories. We become connected in that, but it also helps us re-narrate our stories, woven with this hope, to be able to see other parts of it that we can't see on our own, to be able to help us imagine again.
So I'm thinking of a couple things as you're talking about scars. One is that, we've gotten the example and it's been very powerful. And you've probably seen a lot of this online with women who are showing their mastectomy scars, and that some have chosen to rebuild that area so the scars are not shown, that that's what matters to them, and others where they are leaving it as is, or they're developing kind of this beautiful sort of tattoo, gorgeous picture around it of strength or beauty, because it's part of who they are. And it's part of their story that they want to be able to tell as they're walking around. And so there isn't a right or a wrong way of addressing scars, but that it really think it needs to be your own way, and that that's what's right, so to speak. And then also what to do with invisible scars. A lot of people, more people than not, are walking around with the invisible scars. And so how to honor them, how people can sort of show what they have, even though it's not something that someone else can see or measure. Because also, even with a scar, even if it's visible, it might be short or small, but it could be very deep. And so there are so many ways of looking at scars. So I'm just wondering about how to address it in that way of accepting however you decide to, and also with the invisible part of it.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that because, a lot of mine were invisible. I felt like, even though things were happening so publicly against me, how it was affecting me, or the parts, I was documenting what I was going through in the public meetings and trials, but not in my local church and, the relationships, and I wanted to protect those things in a lot of ways. And they were more private and invisible. But then your body doesn't let you do that, right? Like your body keeps the score, as book's titled. So I always thought of myself as like a tough skinned person, or I could look at this rationally. And yet I start, Rachel, like brain fog. Like I'm having full conversations with my kids. I don't remember them, what they said. I'm unable to like read and write the way that I love to. I left our gas grill on all night long until all the gas ran out. I went on one of my hikes with a girlfriend for 4 hours, returned to my car in the parking lot, and it was still on. I left my car running and unlocked for 4 hours with the keys in it.
Wow. Okay.
These are signs of trauma. Like my body is screaming, saying there's something wrong. So like I think these invisible scars a lot of times, like maybe more women even than men. I'm okay. I'm okay. I got to keep moving on. I know men do struggle with that as well, but I'm okay. And your body's like, no, you're not okay. And so like we still have to name those wounds. And that's harder when they're invisible. And we need help a lot of the time, helping to articulate how to name those wounds and the feelings that they evoke, and being able to process and work through it. I know one thing Diane Langberg says is that when someone's been traumatized, they repeat themselves a lot. They'll talk about the story over and over again. And a good friend or a good therapist needs to continue to listen because it makes so little sense. That's why they have to keep repeating it. Like they can't hold this together in their head. And so you keep saying it in a different way or the same way, just trying to think of how did this happen? How does this, compute? How do I hold this experience? And so it can take a while. And I do think, yeah, the more invisible it is, the more important it is to be able to name, because then you need to lament. And you also need to be able to like bless those things that you were hoping for that maybe
Mm.
weren't met. They were
Mhm.
good things, and
Yeah.
be able to say like, I'm not wrong for wanting that, or I shouldn't feel ashamed for wanting that, but it didn't happen.
Right. Exactly. I'm glad you bring up that whole notion of repeating yourself, because I think There are a lot of people who, out of their own discomfort, need for you to be done. They need,
Yes.
right? They're like, why aren't you over that yet? And really what they're saying is, I'm not really able to hear that story again. I don't know how to respond. I don't maybe have interest in it. It's putting me out of my comfort zone, but I'll make it your issue. And so, thanks very much. But as a therapist, or even as a friend, I guess, but more in the role of therapist, people can tell a story as often as they want or need. But I will point it out to them that they are retelling the story, not to shame, but to then take it to that next place of, so let's figure out what that's about. And what are you needing that you haven't gotten yet, either from me or from the world, from yourself? Maybe you're needing absolution, someone to say that wasn't your fault, or something that hasn't happened in the response to it yet. Or maybe there is this piece, like each time you tell it, there's a new insight, and you're just hoping, right, to have it be more crystallized as you say it again. But there is a reason. And when people say, yeah, I know you told me, or why are you not over it? It's really hard because then it just sits inside of you unresolved. It's very, very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you said that, because that's helpful for the listener, right? Like, to think of those things, like how can I help you here? And what can we lament about this together? Even just, I think sometimes, I heard the definition of joy as, I think it was Jim Wilder who I was reading, who said this, like, the definition of joy is withness. You know, whether you're celebrating something or you are mourning something or suffering through something, when you know that somebody is with you and happy to be with you, like, that's not happiness per se, but it's joy, and that is something that we need for healing.
Yeah. Witness. Wow. A real connection. And what you talk about with really being kind of pushed out and criticized and betrayed by the people, who are significant, you really do need that witness, the connection.
Absolutely.
All the more reason to need it.
Yeah, and then I think, when you have these wounds, um, I think part of the healing too is really asking some basic questions, especially going through like at spiritual abuse. Like, is God who I thought he was? Where do I belong? What do I believe? Like, I put so many eggs in this theological basket of this denomination. And I actually was starting to veer into thinking like theological precision equaled sanctification. And then I'm at these presbytery meetings with all these important people in my denomination, seeing just a lack of maturity, emotional maturity, spiritual maturity, basic maturity, thinking this is horrifying, and to see the arguing and the pretending, like the posturing, there was no love in there. And I certainly was not being cared for. They were referring to me as that lady. I'm sitting right there, making jokes about me. So I'm just thinking, wow, like, so this was a major revelation for me. It's sad to say, but it's just like, you can think that you have all this theology that is so carefully worded, right? And so precisely taught. And this can be the result still in maturity and love, which boils down to the basics of the Christian life of loving God and loving your neighbor, and failing at that. So I think that just being able to get back to what matters here: love, beauty, goodness, truth. It was very freeing for me then to be able to, the struggle of leaving my church and all that. to say that the direction I'm going to go in is what matters.
It's really good. And I think, when you talk about maturity, in fact, I was thinking about that before when you were talking about the criticisms of you. And they're like kids in a sandbox
Right.
kind of
I
language,
mean, my
right?
husband said, like, and it's interesting because we went to a church where a lot of people were, I think, insulated in a Christian subculture. Their kids were homeschooled, a lot of them, some of them were employed in Christian places, and all this. And our kids were in public school. My husband's a public school teacher. And he's just was like, you don't have to be a Christian to know how awful this is. Like, we don't need some like theological teaching to know, like, we just know that this is bad, that you don't treat people like this. And yeah, the witness of it was just so embarrassing.
So I think, I hear that a lot with people who are are leaving religious organizations where they were treated this way. Same thing with some political movements where it devolves into something very base, very like ad hominem attacks. Well, you're ugly, like, really? That's all you got? Okie dokie.
Right. Right.
Right. And you're just wondering, okay, well, how do I raise the bar in this discourse or in my own life? And sometimes raising the bar means leaving that conversation because they're not willing to raise it. And you can't pick them up to whatever point you want them to have that conversation, which is a much higher space, and if they're not going with you, then you just again, cut your losses, which is hard, especially when someone is significant,
And these
yeah.
are people that you care about. Even like, some of these people who I was harmed by, I just cared a lot about. So that doesn't change, you know? So I feel like there was a lot of painful growing I had to do
Yeah,
too in holding these complex things together.
right. I'm wondering now also just in terms of trust moving forward with what you've been through. How do you find that you start to trust someone? What do you need to know? What do you need to see? And also, I guess, how have you guided your own kids to know, like, what do you need to find out about and what questions maybe do you need to ask, right? So tell us about that.
It messes with your whole sense of self to think I trusted these people. I raised my kids in this, and I do try to look at that with honesty, but also with empathy to myself and saying that, okay, I thought some things that were wrong, taught my kids some things that were wrong. I think that some of the ways that we've grown stronger as a family and trust for one another is in this ability to be able to say that without judgment, because this is part of life. This is part of growing. This is part of, this is continual. We use this word repentance all the time. Like, it's so important, but I think we attach like shame to repentance. And I saw like none of these leaders were able to do that, to apologize, to repent. And anybody who did it was weaponized against them. It was like a sign of weakness. So I just thought this is a culture where repentance can't happen. And then I realized that part of it too, like in my own self, it's like you think you need to be like here, and really you're down here, like growth wise. But it's just that turning. It's not this shaming, groveling that I think we picture it so much, but it's a realization. I think, artist Makoto Fujimura says that repentance is that beauty provokes repentance, something like that. And it's so true because, like, when you see the beautiful, it's an invitation really to walk into goodness. That's the turning, right? You're like realizing these things that you're holding on to that are no good, and so there's something very freeing and beautiful about that. So, and being able to, and I'm working on that still, say those things that were wrong that I participated in, where I've harmed. with my kids, I feel like I've also been able to, in my own struggles in this, realize, God is bigger than the box I want to put him in, right? Like, and I think a lot of the times I was thinking about how, whatever their lives was, how that reflected on all of us. And now I just realize how little control I have over all that and how little control I want.
Oh, that's a really important point. Really, really important. I know we're about done with time, and I want to make sure if there were some messages that you wanted to be able to leave the listeners with who are also going through the fire, who are thinking about leaving or who have left and are dealing with, the responses that are just less than, healthy for them, and how to get through that.
Yeah, I mean, one interview I was doing, I was asked, if you could go back and tell yourself 3 years ago some advice, what would it be? And I'm a different person. Like I've had a lot of change happen through this, so I don't know how much I would listen. But um, the first thing that came to my mind was, don't stay in spaces where you're having to prove your own worth. I think that is just kind of a distillation of what was happening there, and I didn't even realize it. And I was talking to a therapist. I was seeing this therapist who specialized in spiritual abuse, and I still was in my church, and he had said to me, Aimee, why do you think you need to be a missionary in your own church? And that was so clarifying. Like, as soon as he said that, I was like, oh, wait, that's not what church is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be the mission field, like, so, that I realized the dynamic was wrong. And, in church, synagogue, or other institution or family, even or marriage that you might be in, like, if you're having to prove your own worth, that is not a safe place.
Right. And I think also just this idea of worth and value, and based on what scale.
I know. And like, if you're having to like prove that you're worthy, valuable, and that you're worthy of protection, that you're worthy of support and care, these are all the things, right? That my voice was worth hearing in this process, that my agency is important. So, yeah, I think that if you're having to do those things, then you're not known. You're not being loved, and you're really not safe.
Hmm. Okay. It's such a powerful message to end on. I am so glad that you spent time with us today to share these messages and to share your latest book. My goodness, you're a prolific writer. And it's interesting to see, as you were talking about the changes that you've gone through the beginning of your writing to now, the flavor that it takes on, and how insightful it's all been. And thank you so much. And I know that you might feel like you just keep taking one for the team because you just keep getting pushback or whatever else. But it's an important thing to do, and to be able to know that you can live through and be able to be strong and still do self-care and so I'm excited for you and for your future.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I do want to end on a note of beauty.
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
note,
sure.
too. It's just beauty captivates us. I think it's such a part of our healing because it's telling us a story. It's beckoning us into the real. And, that's what our hope is in. And so we have this kind of eschatological breaking in when we see beauty of how things really are and what they're becoming. So, those are some simple things to do when you're in pain is to expose yourself to beauty and to really like be attuned to beauty that's around you and seek that out.
Wonderful. Wonderful and beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much. One more thing before you go. Thank you to Aimee for this wonderful conversation today. It is really true with all that she said that there needs to be a formal process to confront abuse, a formal process to confront so much of what happens. But there really is not, and there really needs to be, and there should be in so many different forums. There should be a formal process to confront abuse, to confront neglect, to confront malpractice where that is appropriate. But just as people today still need to try to show how they didn't give consent, and that just by freezing and going along with something doesn't mean that you gave your consent, and just by not trying to kill the person or scream no in their face, you were giving your consent. The law has a long way to go to be able to really recognize this. So I can only imagine how it is in some more controlling and fundamentalist areas of religion. They really are not set up for something that is all too pervasive. And part of the reason that organizations are not set up for it is because they haven't really taken a look at it. They haven't really believed the people who came forward, or they found a way to just tell people to keep it quiet, to not make the church look bad. Families will say, you're going to make us look bad if you come forward with your story. So when you have a situation like that, then no, there isn't a structure in place that is to deal with this and to bring things to light, because most of these organizations that we're talking about here on the show don't want it brought to light. There is something so fascinating about the phrase that Aimee used, that when she was talking about scars, she said, there is the loneliness of the thinking woman. Yes, there is the loneliness of the thinking woman. There's the loneliness of the thinking man as well. Because if we make it, let's say, genderless, as we talk about it now, it is about the same thing, which is when you are really noticing what's happening, and when your critical mind is taking in the evidence, and when you are trying to make sense of things and you no longer can, because either it doesn't make sense or it just ultimately is wrong and feels wrong, it is a very lonely place. It is a place where you know your way of seeing things, your conclusions, are not going to be accepted or acceptable. And they will probably be used to further ostracize you. And I say further because already when you're starting to notice that something's off, you already can feel like you have zoomed out, like you're a mile away from someone just standing right next to you. And you can be very much in your own head. And then if you decide to come forward and are pushed away or not believed, or it's turned back around on you that you're causing the problem here, and that there wouldn't be a problem if were not coming forward with this information, everything would be fine without you sharing the truth. And then you get more and more sequestered, more and more isolated. So there is loneliness when you are thinking. And that's why a lot of people abandon it. Truth be told, a lot of people will abandon it in controlling relationships where they feel there's no way out, or they have believed what the controller has told them, that if they leave, they will have to leave without their children, or if they leave, they'll never find anyone else who would be willing to, quote unquote, put up with them. There are people also who will talk about being told that your thoughts are your enemy. And so I don't think they are your enemy. I think they are the person's enemy who's taught you that idea, who's taught you that phrase. who doesn't want you to be thinking, who doesn't want you to be evaluating, who doesn't want you to be assessing, who doesn't want you to be collecting information and facts to make conclusions. But your critical thinking is part of who you are, and as I talk about it here on the show, it is your safety net. So if someone makes you feel like thinking is going to be your downfall, it's going to be a burden you don't want to have to carry around. It's going to be the thing that will push you out of the social network or will make God not love you anymore. You need to wonder why it is that they're taking away your ability to see what you need to see and know what you need to know and feel what you need to feel. Thank you so much to Aimee. I really appreciate her coming on and sharing so much of her story with us today. Talk to you next week. Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctriNation Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.